Hello, everybody, and welcome to Jive Talk. Sorry, I've been away for a while, but I haven't had the ability to make any videos recently. But I'm back with a special episode. I'm really happy to be doing this today. I've been following these gentlemen for a few years now, even before they launched the Arya Akasha project, and I regard them as highly knowledgeable devotees of the gods, whose work is valuable for all of us, we pagans. And it's a privilege for me to be able to pick their brains this evening. And I think you can too, because if you send a super chat with a question directed to either Curwen or Tristan or me, then we will answer them at the end of the show. And we'll make sure to read that. But here they are this evening, two representatives from the Arya Akasha research project. Welcome to Survive the Jive, gentlemen.
Oh, thank you for having us on. I'm Tristan, and a pleasure to be on the show with you.
Yeah, well, likewise. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning, so if I'm slightly foggy-eyed here, that's why. Thank you very much for hosting us.
Pleasure to have you both. And I have to tell the viewers, I'm very sorry that it will be a delay, a connection delay, but we're in 3 different countries. Curwen is in New Zealand, and Tristan is in the United States, and I'm in the UK. And this is just means that there's going to be some slow responses, but hopefully you'll bear with us, and that the content will make it worthwhile for your patience. So first, I'd like to ask you both, what is the purpose of the Arya Akasha Research Institute?
Right, well, I suppose I better take this one. Way back in 2016, slightly sort of odd story, but I found myself in front of the Durga Murti at my temple, which is a living statue of the goddess, and I was told to do something. I was told to, well, 2 things actually. First up, remake the world in her image, Krinvanto Vishvam Aryam, as of course would sound Sanskrit. But second, as an integral part of this, to research, delve into, and then highlight, illuminate the shared bands of coterminity, of brotherhood, and of belief between the various Indo-European peoples. Bring back together, without erasing the distinctiveness, it must be said, the fundamental unity of the folk in question. Now, from there, I basically got further directed, you might sort of say, that it was not something which one could do alone, especially because we're talking about an incredibly broad array of human history, of, well, so genetic and cultural diversity. The fact that we're all 3 of us sitting in different countries right around the world, even before we get into, say, the Indian subcontinent, the peoples of historic Anatolia, shows just how huge an undertaking this was going to be. So, with that in mind, as I've been called to the holy work, so too did I call others to me. We set up ourselves a research institute. We ran it for about 2 years out of the public eye, building up our knowledge base, getting to grips with the material, and then, of course, we had decided we were going to set up a public outlet to more fruitfully channel our efforts out to actually start reshaping the way in which people around the world can start to view themselves, their heritage, and, of course, the most glorious Indo-European race and religion.
Wow, that's a really great answer. It sounds like a noble endeavor as well, and similar to my motivations in what I'm doing with Survive the Jive project. Based on some of your recent posts, I wanted to ask a big question, somewhat nebulous and maybe difficult to tackle. I'm not sure which one of you want to have a go at it first. Why did the ancient Indo-Europeans have a religion in that sense? Why did
Well, I think it must first be understood that
the Vedic people have a religion?
Right. Well, I think it first needs to be understood that the way we approach the religion is that the gods, the spirits, all these things are quote unquote real. You know, these are beings that actually exist. You know, it's not just a sort of socio-political ploy to get some sort of effective result in society, to, you know, get people to live good lives or to produce some sort of good political effect. It's fundamentally true, and these Indo-European peoples honored the gods because the gods exist. They honored the spirits because the spirits exist. They wish this honoring. It is righteous to do so.
See, that word, righteousness, is absolutely key. I mean, it's one translation for dharma, of course. Dharma, in terms of its etymological predicate, more closely aligns with the notion of what supports, what actually sort of holds together, not just human society, which is a sort of an after effect of the righteous conduct in question, but actually the entire great chain fabric of being in its entirety. The notion of cosmic order is also integral to what we do, and of course to the Indo-European worldview all up. Now, Rita would be one way of phrasing this in Sanskrit. Orlog, supernal law in Old Norse would be another way of approaching it. And I forget the pronunciation for this, but the chaos sune, I think, is the ancient Greek. Oddly enough, something which got kind of forgotten by the time, sort of Athens was at its height in the 400s. But the idea is that by participating in religion, we are in fact playing our ordained part in the ordered fabric of the entire cosmos. So yes, it does, to further a point Tristan was making, lead to an ordered society and an ordered life for the individual. But this is only a part and parcel of the far broader span of order which actually exists all the way down and all the way up. Now, this actually leads into a subsequent point, which I believe you wish to raise around our conception of Dharma Yuddha. So we're just jumping ahead slightly, because there's actually one of my favorite pieces of Hindu mythology for what it illustrates is from the Devi Bhagavatam. Now, this, for those who aren't familiar with it, is one of the more sacred Shakta, goddess worship scriptures within the Hindu canon. Now, the tale in question features a very, very clever demon called Durga Masur, not to be confused with the goddess Durga, although same etymological particle, Durga meaning sort of invincible, which underpins both. Now, most demons in these sorts of tales, they're after two things: immortality and the dominion over the gods. So these forces of chaos and anarchy and entropy, they're trying to overthrow the gods and take their place. Fundamental chaos camp, as the meta-narrative in question would be known. Anyway, Durga Masura is cleverer than just about all the other demons, because usually what these asura do is they petition Brahma after, tapas, austerities, to grant them immortality. And because Indo-European, well, I suppose you could call it divine legalism, which is a fun field by itself, is set up in such a way that Brahma can't actually grant proper, true immortality. It's always got some conditions, some exceptions. And inevitably, as a result of this, the demons in question, whatever loophole there is, the gods will find it, exploit it, and then mercilessly kill the usurper, as is righteously so. But anyway, Durga Masura is cleverer than all these other demons because he wishes for a different boon. What he wishes for is to erase the knowledge of the Vedas. So basically, the rites, the rituals, the hymnals, the knowledge and history which is contained within the mytho-history, I should say, from the minds of humankind. This is done. And the end result of this is that the demon armies in question, the forces, as I've said, of chaos and entropy, and the opposite of Rita, Arita, which is actually there's a pun involved there, because Arta, of course, is being politics and stuff like that. The notion that politicking is the opposite of cosmic law, I've always found very amusing. I've also, on a complete further side tangent, the fact that the older Western sort of cognate to Rita is also Arita. The idea that Zoroastrians have back to front, linguistically as well as everything else speaking when it comes to cosmic law, further amuses me, but I digress. The point is, these demon armies, once the gods are no longer empowered and augmented by the strength of mortals carrying out the rites and rituals of proper homage, they have a far easier time. They force the gods back to the very gates of the heavens themselves. All seems lost at that point, up until Devi, Ari Shakti in this particular context, Ari Parashakti, manifests in the form of Shakambari to actually sort of take the fight directly to the demons and basically annihilate their leader. This is, of course, the way in which Durga gets her name, because she, of course, is unassailable and takes on Durga Masura. Now, there's a long, complex series of things that could be said about this, but I mention it here because it is a fundamental illustration of the point that if you don't do the proper things, the rites, the rituals, the enjoyments, the offerings to the gods, really bad cosmological things happen. It is not simply a case that, I don't know, maybe a harvest fails here and there, although Shakambari being a vegetation deity as well, this does also happen. So there's all these manifestations of the disruption of the divine order. As a brief side point as well, the instances of Ritra, sort of the, well, I suppose you could say enveloping serpent, kind of correlate to the Nordic Jormungandr, which as we know means, sort of big staff, so to speak, the really big snake. Vritra interrupts the water cycle and hoards the waters, disrupting the rains. Now, this is once again a fundamental piece of the divine order, the water cycle, the rains, the monsoon, if we're on the sort of the subcontinent, which is disrupted by this particular demon trying to usurp a natural cosmological function. It is the smiting of him by Indra, which sets back to rights, which sets back to order the fundamental flow of water and therefore human life, which results. But to go back to the main point, when the universe itself is out of order, it is not simply the case that, sort of relatively minor scale bad things happen like a localized drought. As we see from the Nordic Ragnarok myth, potentially, you wind up with the entirety of creation being imperiled and ultimately falling out of kilter into flames, disarray, and destruction, which can, of course, be a necessary thing at the end of time, the paralaya, as, of course, the dissolution, the unraveling, translated from Sanskrit, but not before that particular sort of due time. So in terms of why we do what we do, in terms of trying to ensure that the rites are properly conducted and disseminating this knowledge out to the people, the Indo-European people out there, some of which who have forgotten, broadly speaking, who or what we once were, that is a large portion of what we try and do. Pranvanto Vishvam Arya, make the world noble, in order to protect and preserve it against the demonic scourge which assails us.
Right, that's a great answer, and it's really interesting to me that you have a greater history of scholarship and experience and knowledge on the subject of Hinduism, whereas I've approached Indo-European studies from a different angle, but I've come to very, very similar conclusions, and that the importance of rite and ritual is fundamental and based on the reaffirmation of the initial action of the gods in the world against chaos. So when we perform the rites and rituals, we basically repeat what they did, and we reaffirm order against chaos. It's a very beautiful version of, it's a very beautiful way of seeing the world, and I think it's common to most Indo-European religions. I do think, though, that there is something that someone wrote quite pertinent counter argument here in the comments that perhaps you want to respond to, and it's influenced, I think, also by some quite advanced philosophies from the Neoplatonist school, where they said similar things, whether man really affects the gods through his action. And the question from the comment from the user, I forgot his name, was, how are they gods if their power is contingent on, aka limited by, mortals doing certain things for them? And also, before you answer, Curwen, may I request that you turn your camera off? Though I'm sure everyone's delighted to see your face. I think that the connection speed, the connection issues might be improved somewhat if we just turn the cameras off altogether. Great.
Right. One further point, which I have, of course, just remembered during the course of your previous response, is the highest act of piety in Hindu sort of deontology is the honoring of one's parents, of one's forebears, pitars. The fact that the Indo-European people are descended from the gods, therefore ipso facto shows partially why it is that we honor the gods in exactly the same sort of manner. Now, having said that, I'll get into the answer to this Neoplatonist point that's been raised. Now, the first thing to be said is, as I mentioned with regard to that particular Devi myth, Adi Parashakti is able to manifest in such a manner that, well, she's obviously unaffected by this disruption of the rites, rituals, and divine legalism in order to administer the righteous beatdown of the demon in question, precisely because, as directly identified with Brahman, with Rita itself, cosmic order, she is not actually, how do I put this? She is not actually contingent upon any other, except, of course, in universe. So out of universe, in terms of, I forget the Neoplatonist term question, but as the sort of the fundamental source underpinning of everything being, etc., you therefore have this post-deist conception of divinity also being satisfied, even though everything else in universe, which is effectively contingent upon this pneumatic, I think is the Aristotelian term, even though everything in the universe is contingent upon something else, something greater, something beforehand, out of universe, that fundamental pyre of divinity is above and beyond. But anyway, it is important to note that within the context of Indo-European, well, theology, I suppose you might say, we don't have, broadly speaking, this idea of absolutely, sort of above and beyond, in universe at least, with the exception I've just sort of noted, gods in the Judeo-Christian sense. I note that it'd be a contradiction in terms to have gods plural in the Judeo-Christian sense because it's plural, but nonetheless, all of our gods are in certain senses limited, they are mortal, they die, although often only temporarily, and especially with the ultimate end of the universe. This does not necessarily mean they're not either gods or, and this is directly correlated with that, worthy of worship, admiration, and respect. I mean, in a similar manner, and to go straight back to my paternity metaphor, so to speak, the fact that your father and mother, the fact that any of your ancestors, going back about as far as you care to name, the fact that any of them are mortal, the fact that they are in fact quite literally anthropomorphic, does not limit the severe and strong and righteous depths of positive feeling you have towards them. More importantly, or at least as importantly, it does not limit at all the fact that they have created you, they have raised you, and if you happen to be living at home, they have provided the necessary conditions for your life. If you're an infant, if you're a toddler, and if you're in a really bad housing market, even if you're a millennial, the fact that these individuals, this family unit, this structure which they have created, is what nourishes you, gives you life, and enables you to go on existing. In a metaphysical sense, I must stress and add, the fact that it is not entirely infinite within its power and operates within a certain degree of constraints in absolutely no way undermines the fact that it is necessary for your continued existence, and more importantly, that it is a righteous and rightful debt of gratitude which you continually reaffirm and pay back insofar as, well, honor is probably better than pay back, insofar as you carry out the proper conduct. Also, as a further brief point, I've just remembered the notion of, what's what I'm looking for? Eternal recurrence, eternal return, which I think you implicitly referenced earlier. Messiah Eliade's sort of beautiful concept of redoing the actions which we formerly benefited from, the divine conduct redone by human hands, is, yes, integral and underpinning to a great many portions of Indo-European religious conduct, even though we don't always quite manage to observe it when it's happening right in front of us, and it may in fact be done in rather symbolic sort of manner. Now, I'm not sure if that's quite answered the question, and I'm sure Tristan will have a slightly differing sort of view from the Nordic point. But to make, sort of once again, a core single-sentence synopsis of it, the fact that some of these gods, and once again, Adi Parashakti is over here, or rather up there, I should say, are not entirely infinite in their power, majesty, and glory, in no way undermines the fact that they are hugely powerful, hugely glorious, and hugely, well, integral and significant for us to honor and uphold even here in the modern age.
Yes, and it is exactly that last point that I would like to continue on from. The Indo-European religions, especially the earlier ones, and on the Western side of the family, fundamentally do not possess the notion of an omnipotent or an omniscient deity. In fact, I would argue that such a thing is almost inconceivable to the human mind, which might say something about whether it can actually be immanent within reality itself. But to address the Neoplatonist position of why call these things gods if they are not omniscient or omnipotent, or if they are peers or equals to some other power, you have to understand that to say that a god is not worthy of worship just because they are not omnipotent or omniscient is a fundamentally arbitrary standard and definition for what is or is not a god. There is no objective sense. You're just randomly picking a line to draw in the sand. And it is especially an arbitrary position when the metaphysics don't have anything that is omnipotent or omniscient.
I'd
Right.
further note, in addition to that, the term God, because as you know, I'm a huge fan of etymology, possibly a bit too much. Wittgenstein, I think, said that philosophy was the battle against the bewitchment of our senses by the beguiling use of language. Part of the reason why we do what we do with etymology is to try and unpick this particular beguilement. And there's a double meaning going on there in terms of both A, Maya, a tapestry of illusion, but B, the fact that the fabric of the universe itself is, in I think both cosmologies, effectively made up of words, but we'll get onto that in a moment. The notion of gods, as I discussed in the Calling the Gods article, which is part of the reason why we're actually here in the first place, God is a Germanic word. There are two possible etymological predicates for it which are closely linked. One of which relates to the notion of pouring, in the sense of a libation, sacrifices. The other one of which is closely linked to the notion of calling. That is to say, sort of reciting the verses, calling upon, sort of liturgy and ritual in both cases, you might sort of say. Funny enough, on a brief further note, the Gaute Geet, in fact, possibly Goth, may derive from that first former sense in terms of, sort of Mother Sphere, ironically enough, being the womb of nations from which these barbarian invasions pour forth, but I digress. The point is, it is kind of a shaped like itself argument to talk about the gods. Because the gods are those who we call out to. They are those who we righteously honor via the pouring of the libations and the carrying out of the sacrificial conduct. To say that we disagree with the notion of calling out to them, carrying out these sacrifices, these rituals, these offerings, because, as Tristan has correctly pointed out, we have an arbitrary conception of what a god or gods is to fundamentally misunderstand the very etymological nature of the term God itself. We cannot, therefore, approach the term God conscious of these ancient Germanic predicates and say these are not gods by bringing in a understanding of the term God, in sort of inverted air quotes, which is at best Judeo-Christian. And if not, then sort of fundamentally fantastical, you might sort of say, to try and delegitimate what is an autochthonous and indigenous concept to Indo-European faith from somewhere outside the spectrum. And I do stress that when it comes to Neoplatonist belief, while some elements of the Platonic worldview may in fact have been derived, even if sort of half understood, half heard, half forgotten, from previous Indo-European experience, there is so much else going on over the next few centuries worth of its philosophical development, which could be a show entirely in and of itself, that it is dangerous to try and attempt to assess an Indo-European claim upon these foreign merits or otherwise.
That's a very comprehensive answer. And it brings to mind, going back to what I was saying about Neoplatonists, what Kelso said in response to the Christians who accused him, who raised the question to him of how do you know that these beings you worship aren't demons? To which he responds, if they are demons, we still ought to worship them, because from his perspective, daimon is a creation, is a part of the oneness of all things. It's a creation of the monad, or the one, and is higher than mankind, and is still worthy of being honored in the same way. So it wouldn't make a difference to him whether the deity he had called a god was actually a daimon. He would still proceed to worship it in the same way, and that rather reinforces that the difference in the monotheistic Abrahamic view toward worship of divine beings or superior beings from that of the Indo-Europeans.
See, I understand where you're coming from with it, but I also have a fundamental point of disagreement, and I suspect Tristan's about to make exactly the same one. Now, in terms of gods and demons, it has been alleged that by some people that the difference may, of course, potentially depend somewhat upon where one is standing at the time. We disagree with that point of view. In terms of what a demon is, if you look at the very etymology of the word asura, now sura in Sanskrit means shining one, sort of the brightness, light. Asura, not asura as in sort of the older Rig-Vedic construction, which means mighty or possibly progenitor, but asura, and that's sort of the oppositional prefix put onto sura, means the opposite of shining one, sort of the dark one, kind of like almost sort of dark matter, black hole, that kind of thing. There's a cosmological metaphor there. The point is, these demonic beings are the opposite of aura, of righteousness, of truth, and of this divine light. We can observe that when they are empowered, bad things happen. Basically, it's like the metaphor which occasionally comes up of the two wolves. Now, I don't know if it's an authentic Native American proverb. I've got no idea. The two wolves I prefer are, of course, Sarva and Baba, the two wolves of Rudra, or, of course, Freki and Jerry, the two wolves of Odin, but I digress. In terms of the thing about feeding them two wolves, the one that you feed is, of course, the one that wins. Or if you take a slightly more realistic point of view on the whole sort of subject, it doesn't seem to matter which wolf you feed because they just go on fighting regardless. That is the fundamental nature of reality. And as an interesting etymological point, Orlog, that term I translated earlier as supernal law, divine law in the Germanic sense, in later Germanic languages, much to my amusement, I think it's some of the Dutch ones as well, which of course are Germanic, it actually works out as war. Now, it's much to my amusement that later Germanic people took this term meaning the order of the cosmos and said it meant war, and I'm sure there's something fundamental to the Germanic worldview there. But the point is, we must draw a distinction between gods and demons. In terms of the fact that, and I do understand the point you're making, especially with this daemon, which means something slightly different to later use of demon. Worshipping demons is fundamentally opposed often to worshipping the gods. Now, it does get a bit complex and sort of fiddly in terms of, say, the two Navagraha. A graha, for those unaware of it, is a planet or an astrological body. They're quite integral to Hindu astrology. It's funny we had 9 of them, but I digress. There's 2 Navagraha which aren't conventional planets, Rahu and Ketu. Now, Rahu, if I remember correctly, actually devours the sun in one particular instance, so an eclipse sort of takes place. Ketu is the other half of the lunar node. Technically speaking, they are demons, but at the same time, they are, if not worshipped, at least appeased in order to keep their baleful influence from overwhelmingly afflicting the life of the ordinary devotee. But so it does get a bit sort of blurry, you might sort of say. And also Ravana, to take another particular example, a very pious demon, it must be said, the foremost worshipper of Shiva in that particular point in time. We still sing the Shiv Tandav Stotram, which he composed. Yes, in some places these demons do get their particular due. But fundamentally, there is a distinction between gods and demons in that it is righteous and proper to worship one, but not the other. And we know, both by word of God, to use the the TV trope sort of term, scripture, I should say, and also by the observable consequences of the actions in question, both in terms of the individual devotee and also, of course, the broader macroscopic cosmological effects of it, just whom it is we should be paying honor and oblation to, and it is generally speaking, although not necessarily always, not the demonic ones. I appreciate the point, but both in Nordic, because if you encounter a Loki worshipper,
I should ought to clarify though. I understand your point, well made, but as you recognize, daimon and demon don't mean the same thing, and here we have the problem where people translating Hindu and Indian concepts using Christian concepts, like the word demon as a Christian concept. So the Rakshasa or maybe Mara might be translated as demons, but the daimon, the Greek daimon, is more really akin to a Norse fylgja, and for example, than some inherently negative entity. So when I think this also is something that happened in the example I was talking about, where Kelsus was saying we should worship daimons anyway, because he's assuming that at that stage, anyway, I don't think that the Christian notion of demon was fully distinct from daimon as it is now. And obviously the Christian notion of demon is used to represent something innately negative. I suppose in the Norse tradition it might mean the dark elves or something like that, but and obviously that should not be worshipped. I 100% agree with you. But yeah, this is a problem with semantic and translation.
On that right, point, I think the position of the original issue you raised about how do you know your gods are not demons? Why won't you worship, another group of gods? How do you determine this? Fundamentally misunderstands the entire worldview of the Indo-European peoples. It's anthropologically speaking, there are 2 different types of religions. There is a tribal religion, a folkish religion, and there is a missionary religion. And missionary religions are meant for the entirety of mankind. They're taken down from some sort of revealed truth. You convert everyone, and everyone believes in basically the exact same thing of some culturally vague overgod. But a folkish religion, which is what the Indo-European peoples believed in, is fundamentally our religion. And I mean to stress that word "our," is that these are our gods. The reason we worship them is because these are the gods which belong to us. It doesn't really matter if someone else thinks they're a demon or what their ontological basis might be. It's these beings are fundamentally the gods of our people. For instance, Odin is quite literally our Allfather. And I believe the idea of asking whether or not our gods are demons in from a missionary sort of perspective fundamentally misunderstands this truth.
It's kind of like the old metaphor. I mean, people often attack the notions of nationalism and patriotism, saying, "Oh, well, you know, like, well, what happens if your nation is bad, evil, malefic, etc." Now, it generally speaking isn't, but that is a side issue. And the answer has always been, it's like, you know, my mother, drunk or sober. It's not something you say. What you say is my mother, and if, you know, she does have some issues, then it's best to sort of be helping them as opposed to simply sort of disavowing or abandoning them. But there is an etymological point which I did wish to briefly pick up upon, in terms of what you said about you know, sort of things that should not be worshipped in a Nordic context. Now, Draugr is a fascinating term for what it sort of wound up meaning in you know, sort of in Old Norse, which is effectively undead, or I suppose a more figurative term would be false life. It actually has etymological cognates with the Druj sort of particle in Oruvestan, and I think, now let me just check my notes. Druh in sort of Vedic Sanskrit. What these refer to there is not just you know, sort of demons, or in fact inflictions or pollutions, but fundamentally to falsehood, to lie. So in terms of bringing this back to, you know, sort of why, you know, it's a circular argument, but it does need to be made. Why what we worship are not demons? It is not simply the fact that, as Tristan has pointed out, well, they're kind of, you know, sort of well, not literally in the sense that people of the vague cultist variety often mean it, but, you know, so they're kind of our sort of our forefathers, our ancestors, our progenitors, our primarchs, you might sort of say, and therefore we shall worship them anyway. It is also the fact that they're fundamentally true and accurate and right. I just wanted to briefly pick up upon that etymological point.
Yeah, it's rather like with the family. You know, you have a loyalty to your family, and that isn't contingent necessarily on whether you think that their conduct is better than your next door neighbours. You still owe it to, not to your neighbours, the same level of loyalty that you do to your own family.
I would actually, of neighbours, just briefly, there's a point of Nordic-Vedic Sangha theology, which I do think needs to be brought up at this point. Now, Tristan has correctly mentioned, I should say, the identity of the Indo-European pantheon. I do believe it is a unified pantheon, even though some peoples, like the Greeks, got some of it a bit wrong from time to time, as being our gods, the gods of our people. The question is occasionally raised, and I think this might be where you might actually be arcing towards, because the Nasla party may be in action. What does this mean for non-Indo-European peoples originally, or people who got brought into the Indo-European sphere, in terms of their relationship with the same deities in question? Now, there's 2 points to be made here. The first one is, we generally hold, as a matter of faith, that the reason why, say, the Vedic and Edic traditions, while they are so incredibly close that I have previously suggested they're basically sects of the same religion, because yeah, that's fundamentally what they are. Even though they're so incredibly close, they differ in many manifest particulars. One of which, as I think you wanted to talk about, is the caste system of the Rigstula versus the Katarvana system of you know, sort of Vedic antiquity. The reason for this is because the gods in question had different things they wanted to accomplish for the same overarching unified purpose, the upholding of cosmological order, and therefore slightly differently raised the Indo-European peoples in question. Nordic society tends to have a much more bellicose and, you know, sort of downright hardly martial, you know, sort of orientation to it. Whereas the Vedic society, well, it does also have some strong martial elements, and of course the Bhagavad Gita, you know, it's straight up. It's a tome set on a battlefield for a reason, Kshatriya Dharma. It also has produced priests and an incredibly rich, deep, and most importantly, long-lived and enduring Sanatana Dharma, after all, religious, you know, sort of priestly tradition which goes with it. So different purposes for these Indo-European peoples, the same overarching unified goal. Now, in terms of the other peoples, Dravidians, the Tamils in particular, where do they fit into this? The fact is, I believe, and others may disagree with me or not, that these peoples also, despite the fact they have different genetic and linguistic origins, whether it's because they got brought into the fold, or whether it's because they were already, sort of created a bit of, sort of for an even further separate purpose over here, they also tend to have a fundamental connection to the deities in question. Shiva, after all, is a very strong patron of the Tamil people. Now, the reason why this becomes very interesting is when we actually look at the unfolding of history. When North India was conquered and brought under, in large measure, the sway of the the Muslims after Mahmud of Ghazni, the Mughals, so on and so forth, South India, the Vijayanagara Empire, kept a lot of these traditions alive. So when the centers of Vedic learning were being put to the sword and the flame by these invaders from from the West and from Central Asia, in South India, the traditions, partially because they were in fact recorded also in Sanskrit, but also in Dravidian languages, kept going. And then later on, with the Bhakti devotional movements which took place from the 10th century, I think, on through 13th and 14th centuries, they managed to reintroduce into the the Hindu canon elements which had otherwise fallen by the wayside, and which in fact are so integral and immanent to the later understandings of Hinduism that you'd be hard pressed to actually say, hold on a minute, this looks and sounds a bit foreign. Now, a great example of this is the Nataraja aspect of Mahadev. Now, Nataraja, of course, means Lord of the Dance. It's one of those interesting things, as of course I pointed out in the Ghost Division piece, there's still actually records of the dance associations of the deific complex in question in other Indo-European representations of the pantheon. Dionysus would be one obvious example, as others have pointed out, and also, of course, with Odin, and of course, in the broader sense of dance as a performing art, the later stuff which we talked about with regard to Harlequin and donning of masks, other stuff like that. The point is, the Nataraja aspect, which is the image most people have in their heads when they think of Shiva, is actually a Tamil sourced representation. So it reintroduces back into the Indo-European canon so that we can talk about it here in the 21st century, these elements which have fallen by the wayside to a certain extent and been de-emphasized in other Indo-European traditions. We fundamentally believe, therefore, that even though some peoples are not innately in their origins Indo-European, whether due to the fact they have mixed culture and and blood and language and religion with the Indo-Europeans, now that the Hurrians, the Mitanni Empire may potentially fall into this particular category, or whether it's because they were also created as other projects by the gods in question, and I think the Tamils are probably in this particular category, they nevertheless have a vital and meaningful role to play when it comes to the broader Indo-European sphere. Now, I appreciate, before Tristan turns up my head to sort of shout at me about this, this does not necessarily work in all ways for all Indo-European traditions. The Nordic people, or the Nordic religious revivalist movement, has a thing called the Arya Akasha scale, which talks about how broadly or narrowly they accept other people into their rights. So, in terms of whether you have to be of directly Germanic and Nordic ancestry, whether broad and Northern European is fine, whether Indo-European in general is fine, whether Chinese or African people would also be welcome to join. It's a complex matter. I appreciate that particular different spins on Indo-European religion in the modern age will have different takes on this issue. But in terms of the charge that is often thrown against advocates of Indo-Europeanism in the modern age, that we're only concerned about, white people, ignoring the fact that Finns arguably aren't white, but that is a side issue for another time. The charge that it's only for white people, it's only for a certain sort of people, or it's only for Indian people, is not necessarily always accurate.
Yeah. On that note, what many pagans will say and have argued against me when I say, and when I point to the Vedas, not only do I point to the Vedas as being very instructive and essential, in fact, for understanding the Indo-European pagan worldview, but I also recommend that people who practice European forms of paganism look to modern Hindus and the way they practice, not just scripture, but the daily practice, as a means to inform what their practice can look like. Not to say that we should replicate what they do exactly, but just as a way to see a non-Abrahamic, a non-Christian way, because most people have only experienced devotion in the Christian form, most Westerners, for obvious reasons. What do you think about how the non-Vedic indigenous Indian practices from India, what of their relevance to Europeans who wish to revive native European religions?
I think they are fundamentally extremely relevant to our considerations of the modern faith. Being that our religion has lost most of its actually existent ritual and basis, we can in fact look to Hinduism as a sort of a rough guideline of how things are supposed to look, how things are supposed to be. You have to keep in mind that it is different from the Vedic position, and of course, the Vedic religion was much closer to the Germanic faith than modern Hinduism is. But it's not entirely a hard line in the sand. This is obviously a continuation that never stopped, never ended. It's just progressed through thousands of years, and I mean, so you get some weird sects and things that do some very strange things with rituals and whatnot that are highly incompatible. For instance, I think the Shivist sectarians are significantly closer to the Germanic end of things than would be, say, Vaishnavits or especially Krishnites. But fundamentally, you can look at Hinduism as a sort of guideline in order to how rituals should proceed. Though, as you mentioned, I wouldn't exactly copy them word for word. It should be a much more in spirit sort of thing.
See, what I would say, following on from that, first up, now Zizek, the rather amusingly eminent philosopher of our times, he had this big thing about, in terms of sort of capitalism and moving beyond capitalism. It'd be a very difficult, if not impossible, thing for people raised in a capitalist society to do, because their minds are so heavily conditioned by what they've seen and experienced that conceiving of another world is fundamentally difficult, if not impossible. Plato might have a similar sort of thing with his cave analogy. Now, in terms of a lot of sort of modern European people who are trying to do something like that, they have an advantage over sort of the people who want to try and transcend capitalism, because they can actually look back into. I suppose you can do the same thing with people who want to transcend capitalism, with Tristan in my head once again, but in terms of going back. But you've got these mythological elements to go back to and look to when you're trying to transcend a Christian paradigm. The problem is, as Wilhelm Grumbach, I think, in the Culture of the Teuton says, it's such an alien worldview. Even though it's in exactly the same place a lot of Northern Europeans live today, and just 1,000 years removed, time, of course, is a far greater unit of distance than simple, sort of mere kilometers or whatever, that people get caught up in things. And they nevertheless insistently try and apply Christian approaches to something that is fundamentally non-Christian. Now, in terms of the Krishnaite, theological movements which Tristan references, part of the reason why they're a lot more different often to other Indo-European religions is actually because the same thing happened. The Neo-Vedanta movements of the 1800s, if I can summarize really briefly and by smudging a bunch of details, some of them basically hit on the wild idea of, if we start acting more like Christians, i.e. have monotheism, so to speak, and stop doing the stuff while we're feeding the statues of the gods in public and such, then maybe the British will start treating us like people, as opposed to how Macaulay regarded, I suppose you might, how Macaulay regarded, sort of the Indian faith. It didn't quite work out like that in practice, but it helps to explain part of the reason why some later, within the last 200 years, Indian religious developments are not as close either to Vedic religion or to the broader Indo-European sphere. However, to briefly pick up on something I just said earlier, there's an article which I'm currently in the process of writing. I think it'll form the basis for this year's India National Day article, which we'll put out. We do one of those every year. It's on the gates of Somnath Temple. I won't go into the full detail of it because that'll spoil the surprise. But Lord Macaulay, who was responsible for civilizational vandalism of the Indian education system when he was in India in the mid-late 1800s, he did so in large measure because he really did, despised Hinduism. He thought, as a matter of British imperial policy, that the British Empire should be on the side of Islam, as fellow Abrahamists, fellow monotheists, somebody who was closer in terms of the psyche of Christianity, apparently, should be on the side of Islam against the Hindus. Now, he found himself caught in a bit of a bind, because when he's making this big speech to the British Parliament on these matters, he's also an eminent classicist. He wrote the Lays of Ancient Rome. Out spoke Horatius, the brave captain of the gate. That particular poem was one of his. So he loved what he thought he knew about Greek and Roman religion, and yet he found himself attacking the Brahmanical religion, as he called it, because he had some fundamental misconceptions, or mythconceptions, you might say, about what was actually entailed in Greek and Roman religion in order to try and artificially sanitize these and make them much more distinct from the Vedic religion, the Hindu religion, which he saw existing in front of him. I think that a lot of Indo-European religious revivalists in the West, they look at the imagined, the Hollywood version, the Flanderization, the theme park version, I should say, of their ancestral belief, and they try and artificially say, "Oh, it can't possibly be like Indian religion because so they have an artificial and meme tier perception of Indian religion as well." The final thing I'll say on this particular point is, in terms of a lot of the subsequent developments from Vedic rite and ritual, it's not that they're necessarily depending upon the theory which you wish to use, it's not that they're necessarily innovations, so to speak. Often they're simply continuances of what had gone before. Now, the grand example which we often cite in this particular case is Hanuman. Now, Hanuman, depending upon the theory you wish to use, and I'm sketchy about some of these theories, is occasionally regarded as being an aboriginal deity of India. And you can understand why people have drawn this conclusion. There's some rather bad etymology, as I understand it, linking it to a Dravidian word for, I think, well, I'll get into that some other time. The point is, as a Vanara, a bear or monkey man living in the forest, you can see how somebody drew the obvious conclusion, oh, hey, well, that therefore means it must have been a deity of the people living in the forest. But here's the thing. Hanuman, Bajrang Bali, Bajrang Vajra, is basically running off exactly the same Indo-European deific complex as Thor, is armed with the Thunder Club, is of great strength, is the friend of man, and other points of continuity which we'll explore in an upcoming article. In fact, there's actually a Rig-Vedic hymnal. It's in the 10th mandala, I believe, off the top of my head. It's either, I think it's Rig-Veda, the 86th hymn of that particular mandala, in which Indra is directly addressing this and says, yes, there is a monkey deity, and the monkey deity in question is taking some sacrifices that would otherwise be directed to Indra, because his wife's rather annoyed about this for various reasons. Indrani, he basically says in no uncertain terms, that's okay, that's all good, because we are fundamentally the same. So right there in the Rig Veda itself, you have what is often identified as a later, a Puranic era, Hindu deity with the rites and rituals accompanying, and it's actually squares up directly with the Vedic era material, just as a further development, and thence the actual Indo-European material underlying all of the above traditions. So in other words, people often look for differentiation, whereas in actual fact, what we're seeing is fundamentally unity, especially because a lot of the stuff that turns up in Puranic era mythology, it's actually stuff that it would have been in the milieu in the Vedic time as well. It just wasn't recorded directly in the Vedas itself, at least not directly, and therefore is of similar antiquity, even though it might look like it came later.
Right. I have a few things to comment and then ask and lead to my next question on that. Like, firstly, what you said about the Muslim Hindu bias and the Muslim bias of the British in India, I think that's well documented, and it's a shame, and it is definitely because of a monotheistic bias. And I know not only the Queen Victoria had that herself, but also my grandfather, he had a Muslim manservant there who assured him that if he ever had a Hindu manservant, then he would be stabbed to death in his sleep. And he always found that amusing that the Muslims maintain that. So maybe the Muslims in India helped to perpetuate this bias. Yeah, I think the failure of the British and the Europeans in general to see the quite obvious parallels with European religions is shocking. But I don't know, not all Europeans made that mistake, because obviously the burning of incense, the temples, they can't have failed to see that there was essentially something resembling classical civilization of Europe now existing in India. On to what you said about Hanuman and Indra, that's very fascinating. I hadn't, my own less thorough research had only seen that the origins of Hanuman are somewhat uncertain. I didn't know that there was a certain or an agreed upon assertion that there was a monkey deity in the Rig Veda, but some people argue that he might not really have been a monkey, but that attribute was imposed onto an old deity who may have been of Indo-European provenance. And obviously the monkey attribute can't have come from the steppes, so it was imposed onto a deity at some point. Whether that means it was a pre-existing Indian one, or whether it was an Indo-European one that was altered to become more suited for India, I don't know. But it's certainly, I agree with you, and that your assessment that that there was a totality and a oneness of things, and that the pagan view, whether Indo-European or non-Indo-European, is generally able to see the interrelatedness of religions and traditions, and we can see that with the Roman attitude to Egypt, the Greek attitude to Egypt, for example, and also to Middle Eastern pagan religions. They certainly didn't see this major distinction that we would now impose on it retroactively.
It's also why Hinduism is the most tolerant religion you can possibly find. I mean, seriously, I do not know of any other faith existing in the world today which should openly allow other people, including the Parsis as one particular example, Christians and various other communities, to come along, practice their own religion inside Hindu communities, even occasionally in sort of cultural understanding efforts inside our own temples. As a minor sort of aside, Christmas was on a Tuesday, last year, and on Tuesdays I go to my local temple because it's Hanuman's day. And it was, there was a great big Christmas meal, which was quite sort of delightful. There was some tinsel up, which I thought was a bit sort of far. But they also did, in fact, sing, we wish you a Merry Christmas. And at least, I think, at least one sort of Christian observation of that particular nature. Not because they were sort of going, yes, we'll suddenly become Christians, but rather because they were tolerant and accepting and understanding of diversity within their midst. It was quite a nice, just occasion to be a part of.
Well, I've seen Buddhist temples in Southeast Asia that have tinsel up all year round, so I don't know how incongruous that is with their religion. But to follow on from your previous comments about this totality and on the continuation of Indo-European religious traditions in later Indian religion, post-Vedic. I mean, I've certainly seen very strong arguments to show that there are definitely Indo-European parallels from other Indo-European religions with Indian traditions that are recorded a long time after the Rig Veda, but are not recorded in the Rig Veda. So I certainly think that the idea that you can only find Indo-European, proper Indo-European religion in the Rig Veda and not an Indian religion is false. But there are also some very uniquely complicated and what seem to be endemically and uniquely Indian philosophies that have arisen in the Upanishads, for example. Do you think that these kind of more complex Indian philosophical concepts had precedence in Proto-Indo-Iranic or even in Proto-Indo-European religions?
I generally take the position that the Upashanic philosophies, such as the dualism or monism of various sorts, generally don't have a very good coterminity with other, especially European folk religions. You only really start to see this popping up when you get into the Platonic bits and pieces in later centuries of the BC in Greece, which is fundamentally after a time in which they had almost abandoned their religion. I have to maintain that there is not a direct continuity between the Greek folk religion and Neoplatonism. But I mean, you can see when the Christians tried to start converting the Northern Europeans that they fundamentally didn't hold the concepts of monotheism at all. For instance, you see the Arian heresy pop up with the Goths and not the Goths, but the Vandals as well. And Saint Patrick had to famously teach the Irish about the concept of the Trinity by using the the example of the clover leaf, and of course the Nordic conflations and utter confusion at what exactly Christianity was and what their doctrine meant and everything persisted for centuries. That it's this evidence that they didn't understand these concepts of monism especially, but also dualism. I think there is probably a philosophical underlying of dualism in the Indo-European specter. It comes up quite often in everything from Indo-Iranian to elements of Norse myth, for instance, as the Asir and the Jotuns. But it's slightly different from the actual Indian philosophical conception, because theirs is all based around the concept of Brahman, which Western Indo-European religions just don't possess.
Well, yeah, I'll say a few things, then I'll address that point directly about Brahman. The first one is I've just been reminded of some excellent research Tristan did. I think the line in question comes from the Grimnismal, but there is the saying is the mask one for the those of us who don't speak Old Norse, which is most of us. It refers to Thor as an unwise ape. Now, we've done the etymological research on it, and yes, ape does appear to be exactly the right translation for the word in question. This goes to that Hanuman point which I was making earlier. Therefore, we don't know how the Old Norse had a conception of what an ape was in the first place, but it's a surprising thing to find that exactly the same iconographic descriptor would turn up in sort of Old Norse as it does sort of in sort of the Hindu construction. Now, partially this may perhaps be explained by the fact that when we're looking at these religious texts, we are not just looking at them exegetically. We are not just performing an archaeology of spirit. We're in fact performing something closer, if I might be permitted to use a term, the sociology of spirit. In other words, we're dealing with living, not just traditions, but living beings, living entities. So the fact that we see elements turn up in sort of post-Vedic on the one hand and later Indo-European developments on the other should be entirely unsurprising if we accept for a moment, which we all do, that the gods are in fact real, because they're continually revealing themselves, occasionally by turning up in a funny mustache and glasses and a slightly different hat, in the case of Odin, to re-reveal themselves to the peoples in question. Now, to go to the Brahman point which Tristan was making, it's not quite accurate to say that it's based around Brahman. Yes, a lot of Hindu theology is, but in terms of what Brahman actually is, it's not necessarily sort of just an abstract concept of the absolute. It is also often identified quite directly with both the notion of, or as I said at the very start of this podcast, Adi Parashakti, that is, the pneumatic, the origin, the inception, that kind of thing, the first power, literally, preceding power. But also with Rita, this concept of cosmic aura, which I earlier aforementioned. So therefore, what we in fact see in these particular regards is a situation whereby a lot of the subsequent developments in, basically Puranic and post-Puranic Hinduism are simply derived from making logical deductions and occasionally some word of God stuff going on as well, or word of gods, we might sort of say. And it must always be remembered that mythic truth and what deities tell you may not always necessarily be entirely literally true, but that is a side rant for another time. The point is, it's logical deduction from the idea that, okay, so there is a supernal law, there is a cause which precedes the universe, and which occasionally manifests directly in avatar form to occasionally smite some demons. It therefore logically follows a lot of the developments which take place within that broader purview. Unfortunately, you then wind up with some further developments, which sort of, like I said, turn up in especially the Vaishnava traditions of going, okay, well that therefore obviously means there's only one god, and we can safely ignore all the other gods in favor of Pasco, I suppose you might say, to use a monopoly metaphor, proceed directly to 200 soul points or whatever the currency is. Your life is the currency of the gods, but I digress. The point is that in terms of the Vayu Purana, especially, it has some of my favorite elements, talking about the horse sacrifice of Daksha. That kind of points out why you don't do that, because, once again, bad things happen. But anyway, in terms of one Upanishadic element I did want to bring up, one of my favorite sets of parables, you might say, comes from the Brihadaranyaka, which I pronounced appallingly, but you get what I mean, Upanishad, which has the famous metaphor of the spider in it. Now, I've done some work recently around the concept of Vak. Vak is etymologically cognate with with vox, with voice, and in a certain sense it means speech, especially divine speech. And it is in fact a goddess in terms of the Rig Veda. In fact, there's a particular Vedic hymn in which she is talking to Indra immediately before they go and smite Vritra, in which she is portrayed as being the mightiest of weapons. Speech and words that, well, literally words to that effect. It also can mean thought, or it can also mean, sort of scripture, depending upon context. The point is, in this Upanishadic example, there's a metaphor of a spider, spinning its web and creating via the power of flame within its mouth. Hotra, as of course we would understand, which relates to Havana, fire sacrifice, is the officiant of the sacrifice, but also the voice of the person carrying out the sacrifice, the priest making the calls in the scripture. That's what creates this spider web that is the universe. So you have this fundamental idea expressed in this later Upanishadic source, much more I suppose, evocatively than simply, sort of this goddess is mighty, but actually, sort of going through the motions with the spider unspooling its web to show it in practice the way in which words and concepts actually underpin and create reality. Now, in terms of how this actually winds up working in Nordic metaphysics, Tristan will have to jump in at this particular point, but I fundamentally believe this is part of the reason why runes and other such things, and sort of the saying of binding phrases and such, have the power that they do, because the gods also, in the Nordic sort of conception of things, are running on this exact same idea that language is integral and powerful in terms of the cosmology and the creation and recreation of the world around them as a result. Tristan.
Right. Well, first I would like to go back slightly to what you were saying about the dualist school. You'll have to forgive me slightly because I'm significantly more familiar with Western philosophy than I am Eastern philosophy. I was not aware that the conception of Brahman could also embody the concepts of Rita and, I guess in my vein of things, Orlog. If that is in fact the correct case, then I would agree that the dualist philosophy does appear to be existent in pretty much every Indo-European corpus. I was just writing an article for the new magazine that the Neurona Society is about to put up, and I go into a bit about the concepts of Innengard and Utengard, which is Innengard is within the borders, literally order, that which is associated with the gods, and Utengard is that which is outside the borders, that the chaos associated with the Jotuns. And I mean, you have this as well for the Irish gods, and they have the issue with the Fomorians, the Greek gods with the Titans. It's a common Indo-European parallel, and I think that is actually a very good point. We should probably look into that, research it more thoroughly at some point. But to address your point about the runes and the power of speech, I would entirely agree. This is exactly how the magic art of Galder works. As we know, Odin, when he sacrificed himself upon Yggdrasil, he learned the secrets of speech, of language, of it's a fundamental tenet of reality constructed by Orlog itself, that it exists outside of the gods. It's not their own creation. It's something that is immanent within the fabric of reality, in which they, because they are wise and know about the processes, they can manipulate.
Certainly. I mean, I always like to stress the fact that the word rune, its etymology across the Germanic languages, initially means an esoteric secret or something, an esoteric knowledge, something that is secret, and then it's applied to the symbols rather than the symbols then being representing, being applied to the notion of esoteric secrets. It's that way around, so that these run had this previous meaning in Proto-Germanic, to which it perhaps before runes existed, and that this concept was applied to the notion of runes when because they were, that they were seen as like a pre-existing secret to be discovered, rather like what you said, and even Odin himself has to discover them through a ritual, a ritual sacrifice. Also to carry on what Tristan was saying about the Innengard and Utengard, Innengerd in Old English, and Utengerd, that rather reflects what, as Curwen earlier mentioned, Mircea Eliade, the Romanian author, has written about how many religions, not just Indo-European, have this notion of like the inner and the inner group and the outer group, and just as the gods have their inner group, when we battle against an outer group, it is a reaffirmation of this god, this battle of the gods against their enemies. So we're repeating their actions in an inferior sense to their superior one. This has been really interesting. I think we've got time. I'm going to go a bit over time for this to carry on. And we've got a couple of comments on the, before I ask the next question, I'll quickly do a couple of the super chat comments. We've got Alison Wagner says it's a great stream. Thank you. And thank you, Alison, for your donation. Apothecary Herbalist says, hail the sun riding the chariot. I always thought the sun was pulled by a chariot, but thank you very much, Apothecary. There's a question for you, Curwen. Perhaps you want to answer it now. Before it says, which discovered Baltic/Vedic links? I don't know if you know about the Baltic subject of Baltic paganism, but he presumes you do. Etymological or otherwise, have been most important for reconstructing the European religions.
That's a fascinating question, and it's something which I'm actually doing some research on right at this particular moment. Now, unfortunately, I don't actually have a really good answer for this, and there's two reasons for it. One of which is my knowledge of it is still, developing. But second, the really big issue with Baltic religion is that while the Baltic languages, Lithuanian in particular, like there's that quote from I think the 1800s in which somebody said, "If you want to hear what Proto-Indo-European sounds like, go speak to a Lithuanian peasant." Now, as it happens, despite the fact that Lithuanian is actually very close to Sanskrit in a number of key ways, like it's really, really quite an interesting thing to look at. The religion has not been as well preserved for obvious reasons. I mean, there was some big-ass crusades that went through there about 800 years ago. So what we've got in terms of a lot of Baltic religion is actually the results of romanticists and sort of the usual caveat emptor in terms of Christian missionaries and others going around and trying to recollect folk tales or interpreting what they saw and filtering it through particular sort of perspective lenses which were not always accurate. Now, a grand example of this, if we might briefly segue into the Slavic religious area, is drawn from the Hypatian Codex, I think it is. The point is that it's a rather famous source which talks about sort of the gods of the Slavic people. But the trouble is, what goes on in this is the Greek source, or the Greek language source, I should say, is Byzantine, writing about the Slavic religion in question from I think about the 6th century AD. It gets reinterpreted and reinterpolated by subsequent commentators. So by the time we have a source which we can actually use, what we have is 3 different layers of recension, or sort of repetition and garbling, talking about an ancient mytho-history of Egypt, restaged with questionably understood Greek pagan deities, and then briefly translated on a name basis, possibly, we don't even know, to Slavic words to try and make it more familiar for a subsequent Slavic audience. Now, I accept there are other Slavic sources which, are more useful in this regard, but when you see people talking about Svarog as being a celestial blacksmith, that's because in this particular one source, somebody identified the god king of Egypt as being Hephaestus, and then translated that to, not necessarily, in terms of simply being a divine king, but in terms of being, sort of a guy with a hammer or something like that, as, or Hephaestus, I should say, to Svarog. So you can see how the idea of a celestial blacksmith as king of the gods is not something easily supported in other Indo-European religion. But you can see how it's also resulted. So to bring it back to the Baltic religious revivalist movement, there's some very cool stuff that these guys do, definitely. And it amuses me in a very positive sense, the way in which often the the Baltic revivalists will cooperate directly with Hindu communities and almost be sort of one-to-one intertransmissible. That's a great example of Indo-European religious sodality. But in terms of the the use of Baltic tales to reconstruct European religions, the other Indo-European religions of Europe, I should say, it's a bit of a fraught field. There are definitely some strong linguistic and etymological elements which can be brought to the fore. And linguistics is very useful for theology, funnily enough, as of course we just previously discussed. But I am very cautious when it comes to a potential over-reliance upon these potentially rather questionable sources which we have for Baltic religion. Now, that is not to disrespect anybody of Baltic religion, faith, ancestry, etc. It's just simply a caveat emptor, or caveat literator, I should say, when it comes to looking at these sources directly and in unvarnished sort of sense. But I will be looking into these further, and I'm sure you can see some further publications from us on that particular regard. I'm sorry that doesn't more comprehensively answer the question.
Yeah,
I would like to very quickly add there that, along with what Curwen said, we have a similar problem with the Greek subset of the religion, in which people in the past used to presume that this was a good default standard in which to view the rest of the Indo-European sphere. And as we've realized through various amounts of theology and archaeology and everything, it appears that this actually isn't very much the case. It is one of the most corrupted and syncretized versions of the myth, which aids in the difficulty of using Slavic mythological bits and pieces to reconstruct Indo-European mythology and theology, because it's, as Curwen mentioned, itself based on the Greek myths, which are themselves highly syncretized with other Near Eastern religions that are not Indo-European.
Wait a sec. I've got a couple of comments. One is the Baltic sources, from what I understand, are not intellectual. They're just basically recorded anthropologists recording the behavior of Lithuanian peasants and what they do. So you could say it's syncretic in the sense that they may have absorbed some Christian things, but I very much doubt we can say that they would have absorbed anything from Greece or Egypt. But as for what you were saying about, Tristan was saying, what sort of Greek source are you talking about that was heavily influenced by syncretism?
Well, for instance, you can see the position in as Zeus is he takes a position that's more akin to what we would call Thor or Indra, in which he is a thunder god figure, which has more to do with the Near Eastern Hittite mythology and also the Mitanni, which some Sumerian deities as well. And there's also
Indo-European too, though.
Well, to see this,
well,
this
not
is
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Curwen.
Yeah, if I might, this is actually a large part of what my work on the Hanuman Thor piece is directly covering. Now, if we might in terms of the divine family, I suppose you might say, the archetypal model at the heart of the Indo-European pantheon, what you have as the father figure is, of course, the sky father, Deus Pitar, Deus Pater, if we're speaking Latin, which amuses the hell out of me when it comes to Catholic liturgy, but that is a matter for another time. Now, in terms of the classical renditions of this particular name, we have, of course, Deus Pitar, so once again, Sky Father, Jupiter, and so on and so forth. However, the son of the Sky Father is the Thunderer. The striker is the other way of referring to it, because there's that per particle in Proto-Indo-European, which we see turning up in Perdicornos, also funny enough in Perseus of Greek mythology. Ironically, oddly enough, on a brief tangent, the Persians actually tried to use this as a bit of propaganda, you might say. They were saying, oh, yes, Perseus must have been Persian. Your great hero is Persian, so it's all good. Now, I digress. The point is, the son of the Sky Father is this, sort of this thunderclub armed deific persona who is the striker. Hercules runs off this particular divine complex, has a club, has the great strength, is the friend to man, so on and so forth. Hanuman, as we have seen, has the club, has the the act of striking, the smiting of the water serpent, or in Hanuman's case, it's more of an outwitting. The Hydra is one particular example in sort of Greek mythology. Indra, same deal, has club, great strength, smites serpent, demon, dragon. Thor, same deal for a third one, and so on and so forth it goes. So what's happened here is, if we look at the Greek rendition of things, we see how things have become garbled, because the Sky Father persona has become conflated with the son of the Sky Father in two different ways. Well, actually, the same ways, I should say. The first one is, we look at Zeus in terms of Zeus's mythic deeds, sort of the smiting of Typhon using a thunder club, but also, and of course, the behavior with regard to some of the womanizing. But second, in terms of the earlier layers of Greek cosmogony, so the creation of the god son and so forth, who is Zeus's father? Zeus's father, I think from memory, I may be correct about this, it's either Kronos or Uranos. I think it might vary depending on telling. Uranos, arguably cognate with Varuna, although possibly not just for the reasons which Dumas will, of course, set forward. Uranos is a sky father. It is literally the sort of the sky which rains, which clouds, so on and so forth. So we have this thunder deity persona, which is what we now know as Zeus, who is the son of a sky father, who carries out a lot of the stuff which other thunder deities from other portions of the Indo-European pantheons do. And yet, to also echo the original mythic setup, we look at the sons of Zeus. We look at Hercules, we look at Perseus, and in both cases, those figures are carrying on the archetypal resonances of this, storm deity, son of the Sky Father, even though they are themselves the sons of another storm deity, because Greek myth has separated and garbled in two different directions the fundamental initial Indo-European setup. Now, in terms of what Tristan was alluding to with the Hittites and the Mitanni, what actually might have taken place there, and also with the Greeks due to their trading relations, so on and so forth, is the Mesopotamian peoples strongly influenced obviously those who are in contact with sort of the Hurrians and so on and so forth, so that Marduk, sort of the bull of heaven, their storm lord of their pantheon, winds up being syncretized and regarded as the the king of the gods in Greek mythology, displacing this, and of course being syncretized with this sky father persona, which we can still see the traces of linguistically as well as mythologically.
Yes, well, no doubt the Greeks, like all Indo-European subsequent Indo-European religions, have diverged from Proto-Indo-European and been influenced by other things. Perhaps even indigenous Minoan religion was influential on the Proto-Greeks as well, I suspect. But I still would maintain that the Homeric sources are some of the best sources we have on Indo-European religion. They're very
absolutely. When I say the Greeks are sort of corrupted and syncretized, I'm not referring to the Homeric sources, which are in fact some of the purest ones. But we have to realize that the mythology that most people are familiar with later on, the classical period towards when we get the Athens and Sparta and Corinth and that sort of thing, these are actually very divergent from the Homeric sources in some sense. A lot of these people are syncretized with various Eastern mystery cults, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Orphic mysteries. These are all things that came through trade and merchants and whatnot from the Near East, and even in fact some from India. That there's a bit of a syncretization there, which is of course an Indo-European source, but they also did it with the Egyptians and the Semitic peoples of the Levantines and the Anatolians, non-Indo-European Anatolians, and it's very difficult to.
Indo-European and Anatolians. I thought the Anatolians were Indo-European, the Phrygians and the
not all of them. Of course, some of them are, like the Hittites are, and at least the upper echelons of the Mitanni. But of course, some of the Anatolians aren't. Of course, like the Assyrians are a Semitic people.
The Assyrians didn't live in Anatolia, did they?
They did at one point.
Oh, okay, then they expanded their empire that way. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, the Luwian language speakers, which are related to their language related to Hittite, the ones who inhabited what's now Western Turkey, is generally Indo-Europeans. That includes the Lycians and other things, and they're probably quite close to Hittites in language, but and the Trojans may have been as well.
I was actually just about to raise that point. So this is the nasty party we talk about. It is a fascinating fact, the reconstructive work that's gone on with the Trojan myth to connect them to the Luwians. I think Priam's name connects with a Luwian word which means brave in battle or something like that. But in terms of what Tristan is saying, just to make it clear for our listeners, what we are referring to is the people who were there before the Indo-Europeans turned up. Now, the Hittites are actually a grand example of this in practice. If you indulge me just to consult some notes I prepared about a year earlier, so just give me 5 seconds. What effectively happens with the Hittites is they did not actually call themselves the Hittites. That's a sort of a later sort of biblical interpolation on it. I think from memory, what they actually referred to themselves as was the Nesili, and they. Of course, the Hittite bit seems to come from the name of the capital, the Hattusa, Hattus, that sort of thing. What happened there is they basically rolled in, as of course is the conventional Indo-European behavior, and they wrecked up the place. and took on both the name of the place which they sort of previously found themselves at. Ironically enough, given my habitual distaste for a certain, or sort of Vice morality, we'll sort of say, it's actually, I think, possibly the name of a market complex within the city, but I'll have to consult my notes. But the point is, we can identify the times at which these Indo-Europeans, these Anatolian Indo-Europeans turned up, by the fact that there tends to be a fine depositional layer of carbon from the city or settlement in question being on fire at pretty much exactly the point in question this happens. I think from memory, although I have to check, it's about 1,700 BC that this takes place. So what Tristan is referring to when he talks about non-Indo-European Anatolians is not, of course, the sort of the Anatolian Indo-Europeans, the Hittites, the Luwians, Lycians, so on and so forth, but those pre-Indo-European peoples who were there and got conquered, subjugated, and had various elements of their religion, perhaps their language, incorporated in after they'd obviously started rebuilding the city, were just burnt down.
Fascinating. Well, before we finish, I think we've got time for one quick more question, and I want to go back to leave Anatolia and the Levant and go back to the initial topic of the Vedic and the Nordic, which you have identified as two very you specifically more interested in using these sources to inform your respective religious practices. Now, I forgot to clarify this at the beginning for my viewers and listeners who may not actually be aware, but could you each just say what religion you practice, each of you, and how both the Nordic and Vedic traditions inform your respective ritual practices that you normally perform?
Right. Well, me personally, I would self-identify as a Germanic heathen, though in regards to the Neurona Society and Mark per Year, we are somehow coming up with a different term, which they're terming Sethian. I'm involved with that as well. But basically what it is I am literally a Germanic pagan in that I worship the Germanic side of things. That's very different from Curwen here, who is a Hindu.
To pick up on that point, which is wonderful. Sorry.
No, please continue.
Yeah, so to pick up upon that point, it's a very interesting question because, of course, Hinduism is far broader in terms of its, I suppose, spate of allowable practices in some regards because there's just simply so much more to go on. But in terms of how I would describe my own religion, the answer which I put upon the census form I filled out here in New Zealand, I think last year from memory, was that it is that of the Nordic-Aryan Sangha, with particular Hinduism with Shaivite and Shakta characteristics in particular, but also with that Nordic element, nevertheless infused in terms of the understandings in question. Now, it is important to note that the devotional practices, the rituals and rites and liturgy, which one chooses to engage in, it is not because they are convenient to you, not most of the time anyway. It is not because they might have seemed like a good idea at the time or you saw something in a film which was cool. They are there because A, they work on a metaphysical level, a resonant level, intrinsic with the nature of reality of them. But also B, because you have been told to do these things in a particular manner by scripture, by priests, and often ultimately by word of God or word of gods, as the case may be. Now, this matters because in terms of the article I wrote way back about 2 or 3 weeks about calling the gods, the notion is you're going to get a hell of a lot further if you're calling upon someone, calling them up on the phone even, if you are polite and respectful and use their language. Whether that's because of course all these are Indo-European languages, whether that's the language which they're more comfortable with, or whether that's the language which is immanent and intrinsic to the ritual practices in question. The fact is, if you have been told to do things in a particular manner, you should be thinking long and hard before you actually start varying these sorts of manners in order to basically to make it easier for yourself. Now, the risk with syncretism, what we do not view as syncretism. What the ancient Greeks did when they rolled up into Egypt and they said, okay, so this deity the Egyptians have for politically convenient reasons, we're going to bolt on to one of our deities, because it's a useful thing for us to do. That is syncretism. That is bringing together things that are not alike and saying these are now synchronized, even though they might not be. What we do is very different. We are illuminating coterminities and approaching things not always via the same sort of paths, but heading towards the same goal. Having said that, we have actually engaged in some experimentation is the wrong word, although we are also experimental theologians in addition to being combat theologians, in terms of developing liturgy which works both in Old Norse and in Sanskrit, occasionally drawing deliberately upon the pun values in both and either, and of course Proto-Indo-European in there as well. So we are experimenting in this area, but for the most part, in our own personal practices, we tend to go, okay, the gods asked us to do this in such a particular and defined manner. Therefore, we are not going to be disrespecting the appropriate ways in which to do things. But having said that, I can definitely clarify and confirm the appreciation and awareness and understanding of the fundamental unity of these particular deities does, in fact, mean that oftentimes, with the liturgy in question, it can be the same thing by different meanings. Like if you go through the list of Shaivite theonyms, for example, as you will have seen from the Ghost Division piece, the fact is, many of these are in fact one-for-one, directly, literally one-for-one sub-ends, or, well, not sub-ends, that's the wrong way of phrasing it, one-to-one translations, interpolations for the same theonyms which occur in Odinic liturgy and things of that particular nature. So therefore, there is not actually a contravention to be had there. Having said that, I do maintain that in both cases, rather than either, both cases, there are elements from each tradition which has been remembered, and more emphatically than in other places, which are brought back together to inform our understanding of the collective whole.
That's great. A good sort of ending point. I think we can. Your assertion of the importance of following the traditions as they've been passed down to us is a good ending note that I'd like people to keep in their minds in future, because it's really important, whatever tradition you choose to follow. And I think I should recommend that you do so also, even when you are looking at other traditions to help inform and enrich your knowledge of your own tradition, you have to make sure that you're not confusing them, and that they are there's a difference between synthesis and syncretism when you're making sure that these are genuinely equivalent.
Yes, that is exactly it in a nutshell.
Right, and I mean, I could say personally, to give an example, I have there is no written example anywhere in Germanic paganism that I'm aware of that lists incense as an offering. But since incense is a suitable offering in many other Indo-European religions, in Greece, in Rome, in India, I imagine that it would have been. It does not contradict the metaphysical truth of Germanic religion to offer incense as an offering. And since it is something that's widely available, and it's something that I can observe in an existing Indo-European tradition, it's something I consider valid to incorporate into Germanic paganism in the 21st century.
Well, you know, Tom, that's a very interesting position you mentioned there, because when you're talking about rituals and you're using Hinduism to inform Norse rituals, you have to understand and keep in mind the exact the meaning behind, the metaphysical purpose behind the ritual itself. And it's not just like a barren, dry set of things where you do this and then you do this and then you did this because it was written down. These things were offered because they have some sort of metaphysical importance, that they have a reason why they are offered. And if something doesn't violate the reason, or it meshes particularly well with the metaphysical reason for the ritual, then it's perfectly fine to incorporate it.
One example which I'd use to illustrate this point further. Now, I don't know if your listeners are aware of the, Shivling Puja, basically. A Shivling is a Shaivite altar. The puja in question is carried out using milk. There's a long article on the process writing how it links up with, the Milky Way, Odin, so on and so forth. But it's carried out in part via making an oblation of milk upon the altar in question. Now, in my younger years, for various really interesting reasons, which we won't go into here, I spent 3 months stationed at a Shaivite mandir in South Auckland. At the time, there was this really, really I suppose, fancy and well-regarded chocolate milk called Lewis Road Creamery chocolate milk that had come out in New Zealand. It was really good, apparently. So much so that supermarkets were literally, I'm not making this up, putting security guards in front of their fridges and limiting it to one per customer because they're afraid of robberies and things like that. Now, one day at this particular temple I was at, somebody carried out an act of Shivling Puja using a bottle of Lewis Road Creamery chocolate milk. Now, technically speaking, this doesn't really have easy Vedic precedence because, back in the day, you'd be using milk from particular sorts of cows and it probably wouldn't have chocolate in it. But the symbolic elements of it, the fact that this is a very high-priced, very valuable milk and apparently tastes really good, I think actually made it a very suitable, eminently so, ritual offering, even though it didn't have the direct precedence which one might otherwise expect. So to draw upon your point with regard to the incense and what Tristan has said, you're completely correct. Go always back to the purpose. Do always that which honors and hallows in your heart, and you can't go too far wrong as long as you don't run smack into some scripture.
Indeed, and I've said also elsewhere in another stream, I think, if you which do you think the gods would prefer, a cheap bottle of supermarket mead or a very expensive bottle of champagne? Obviously, the Norse didn't have champagne, but the principle of value and giving up value in sacrifice is what's central to the act of sacrifice. So that should be considered more than historical accuracy in the minutiae of the ritual. You have to take a wider perspective on it. But I'm afraid we've gone. So I'll let you make one more point before we finish off. Please.
Right. I was going to say that even in records that we have from Tacitus, he records that when the Romans came onto the Germanic tribes and they started trading wine, they started using wine in place for the sacrifices to Odin and Tyr. So this is a thing that our own ancestors participated in, where they figured, oh, we have a new sacrificial item, we'll just use this.
I believe one of the Latin nicknames for Germanic people was meant literally wine bag, because they took so much wine with them wherever they traded with the Germanics. So obviously the Antipodean tradition of drinking goon it has ancient Germanic provenance. But I will say thank you very much to both of you for joining me this evening, and thank you to all the viewers for watching. Yeah. It's been a real pleasure having both of you, and I've learned a lot, and I hope my viewers have too. And I'll be editing this and re-uploading it as a podcast, and which will be available on Spreaker and iTunes for those who follow podcasts in that sense. Please also, can you, before we finish off, just quickly tell my listeners and viewers where they can follow Arya Akasha and learn more about your work?
Right. Well, thank you for having us on. I really appreciate having us on with you. You can follow Arya Akasha. We have a Facebook page under Arya Akasha Research Institute. We post quite often there. And also we have a WordPress site, which I believe Curwen will have to deliver the actual address, but I believe it is in fact just aryaakasha.com.
Now, to spell that out, because not everybody's going to be transliterating the vocalized Sanskrit through Latin characters, A-R-Y-A A-K-A-S-H-A, Arya Akasha. Like Tristan said, there is a Facebook page. Most of the material goes up there, possibly first. There's some quite lively discussions going on there at the moment. Also, the WordPress site, which tends to have everything in sort of archival and easier to find mechanism. We're working on getting some broader distribution channels operative at the moment with our institutional partners. And if all else fails, you can generally find a whole hell of a lot of everything Indo-European upon my personal page. We look forward to you joining the conversation.
Thanks very much, guys. And I'll put the link to the WordPress site in the description of this video. So you didn't catch all that. Just if you're not watching it live like now, because I haven't put it in yet, but if you're watching this later, you'll find the link in the description. Okay. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Cheers.